The deadliest pandemic in history. What if the deadliest pandemic in human history didn't simply kill millions, but permanently change the course of civilization? What if a disease so devastating swept across continents that entire villages disappeared, economies collapsed, kingdoms weakened, and the survivors believed the end of the world had arrived? According to estimates from the World Health Organization and historians studying medieval Europe, the pandemic known as the Black Death is believed to have killed between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone between 1347 and 1351, with some global estimates exceeding 75 million deaths. In many regions, as much as 1/3 to 1/2 of the population may have perished. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The greatest mystery is not simply how so many people died. It is how humanity managed to survive, and how the world that emerged afterward was never the same again. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and let me know in the comments which period of history fascinates you the most. Is it ancient Egypt, Rome, medieval Europe, the Mongol Empire, or another civilization? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now imagine waking up in the autumn of 1347. The Mediterranean Sea is calm. Merchant ships approach the bustling port of Messina in Sicily. Their sails flutter gently in the morning breeze. Dockworkers prepare to unload valuable cargo. Merchants anticipate silk, spices, precious metals, and exotic goods from distant lands. Nothing seems unusual. Yet hidden aboard those ships is an invisible passenger, one that will soon change history forever. The truth was far more complicated. To understand the Black Death, we must travel even farther east, across the vast grasslands of Central Asia. Here, ancient trade routes connected China, Persia, India, the Middle East, and Europe. Known today as the Silk Road, these routes carried wealth, knowledge, religions, and ideas across thousands of kilometers. They also carried disease. For centuries, merchants crossed deserts and mountains with caravans loaded with silk, spices, precious stones, and rare textiles. Every successful journey strengthened international trade, but every journey also created new opportunities for disease to spread farther than ever before. Historians still debate the precise origin of the Black Death. Some researchers point toward regions surrounding modern-day Kyrgyzstan, where archaeological discoveries suggest plague outbreaks may have occurred shortly before the pandemic reached Europe. Others emphasize broader regions of Central Asia. Although the exact starting point remains uncertain, most historians agree that expanding trade networks played a crucial role in its spread. What happened next shocked everyone. The expansion of the Mongol conquests connected enormous territories stretching from East Asia to Eastern Europe. For merchants, this created unprecedented opportunities. Goods traveled faster, people traveled farther, empires exchanged knowledge more rapidly than ever before. But disease also moved with remarkable speed. The same roads that carried prosperity became pathways for catastrophe. Imagine standing in a crowded caravanserai somewhere along the Silk Road. Merchants from Persia negotiate with traders from China. Camels kneel beneath heavy loads. Languages from across Eurasia fill the air. Children laugh while travelers prepare evening meals. No one notices the tiny stowaways hiding among grain sacks and cargo. Small rodents accompany caravans. Fleas feed upon them. Neither merchants nor rulers understand the danger. Modern science identifies the bacterium Yersinia pestis as the primary cause of plague. 14th century people possessed no such knowledge. They could see illness, they could witness death, but they could not understand the microscopic world responsible. When sickness appeared, people searched for explanations using the knowledge available to them. Some blamed poisoned air. Others believed unusual planetary alignments had disrupted nature. Many interpreted the disaster as divine punishment. Fear spread even faster than the disease itself. By 1346, plague had reached the important trading port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. The city became the scene of one of history's most debated episodes. According to later accounts, forces of the Golden Horde besieged the city while suffering from plague themselves. Some historical sources claim that infected bodies were thrown over the city walls in an attempt to weaken the defenders. Historians still debate how accurately these reports describe the event. Whether or not the story unfolded exactly as later chroniclers described, one fact remains clear. Ships eventually departed Kaffa carrying refugees and merchants. They unknowingly carried plague as well. When those ships reached Mediterranean ports, the consequences became unimaginable. Imagine the harbor at Messina. Sailors stagger onto the docks. Many are gravely ill. Some collapse before speaking a single word. Local authorities rush to investigate. Families gather along the waterfront. Within days, similar symptoms begin appearing among the townspeople. No one understands why. No one knows how to stop it. Panic quietly replaces curiosity. What happened next changed Europe forever. Port after port reported mysterious illness. Messina, Genoa, Venice, Marseille. Trade routes that had enriched Europe now carried devastation from city to city. The medieval world possessed no concept of bacteria. Doctors relied upon theories involving bodily humors. Many prescribed herbal remedies, bloodletting, prayers, or aromatic substances believed capable of cleansing corrupted air. Some treatments provided comfort. None could halt the pandemic. One lesser-known fact reveals how desperate people became. In several cities, physicians wore long robes and distinctive beaked masks filled with fragrant herbs. Although these famous plague doctor costumes became more common during later outbreaks rather than the initial Black Death, they reflected a widespread belief that pleasant smells could protect against deadly disease. The image would eventually become one of history's most recognizable symbols of epidemic fear. The truth was far more terrifying. The plague spread with astonishing speed. Families who shared meals together one week sometimes found themselves burying loved ones the next. Markets grew quieter. Church bells rang constantly. Entire neighborhoods fell silent. Some villages lost so many inhabitants that fields remained uncultivated for years afterward. Imagine walking through a once busy marketplace. Wooden stalls stand abandoned. Merchants have vanished. Doors remain locked. Smoke no longer rises from many homes. The sounds of everyday life have disappeared. Only uncertainty remains. Every knock at the door brings new fear. Every cough becomes a reason to worry. Every traveler becomes a possible threat. The disease did not respect wealth. Kings feared it. Priests feared it. Merchants feared it. Farmers feared it. No fortress could completely isolate its inhabitants. No city wall could guarantee safety. As the pandemic advanced across Europe, governments struggled to respond. Some ports attempted to restrict arriving ships. Certain cities experimented with isolating newcomers before allowing them to enter. These early public health measures were imperfect, but they represented some of the first organized attempts to limit the spread of infectious disease. The word quarantine itself would eventually emerge from practices requiring ships to remain isolated before passengers could disembark. But this was only the beginning. The greatest wave of death had not yet arrived. Within a few short years, the Black Death would transform nearly every aspect of medieval society. It would challenge religious authority, reshape economies, alter the balance of power between peasants and nobles, and leave psychological scars that endured for generations. The deadliest phase of the pandemic was still ahead, and what happened next would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. The Black Death was no longer confined to a handful of ports. It had become a catastrophe without precedent. From the icy coastlines of Scandinavia to the bustling cities of Italy, from the villages of England to the kingdoms of Eastern Europe, the plague advanced with terrifying speed. Entire communities watched helplessly as neighbors who appeared healthy in the morning were gravely ill by nightfall. Death had become an ordinary part of daily life. Imagine walking through the streets of a medieval city in the spring of 1348. Church bells ring almost without pause. The smell of smoke fills the air as families burn clothing and belongings they fear may carry disease. Market stalls stand empty. Windows remain shut. The laughter of children has disappeared. The silence itself feels frightening. Every knock on the door brings anxiety. Every stranger becomes a possible source of infection. No one knows who will be next. What happened next shocked everyone. In many towns, the number of deaths became so overwhelming that cemeteries quickly filled beyond capacity. Large burial grounds had to be created outside city walls. Priests, doctors, and gravediggers worked until exhaustion. Some became victims themselves. As the pandemic intensified, even the people responsible for caring for the sick found it increasingly difficult to continue. The truth was far more complicated. Not everyone experienced the plague in the same way. Some regions suffered catastrophic losses. Others escaped with comparatively fewer deaths. Historians continue to debate why mortality varied so dramatically. Climate, population density, trade connections, public health responses, natural immunity. Each may have played an important role. One of the greatest mysteries remains why some households lost every member while neighboring families survived almost untouched. Medieval people searched desperately for explanations. Some believed the stars had aligned in an unfortunate way. Others blamed poisoned wells. Many interpreted the plague as God's punishment for humanity's sins. Religious processions filled city streets as people prayed for mercy. Yet despite these efforts, the disease continued spreading. Fear often proved as destructive as the illness itself. Rumors spread rapidly. Suspicion divided communities. In several parts of Europe, innocent minority groups became targets of false accusations. Many suffered persecution because frightened populations desperately searched for someone to blame. Modern historians emphasize that these accusations had no scientific basis and reflected panic rather than evidence. The pandemic revealed both humanity's compassion and its darkest fears. Yet even amid despair, remarkable acts of courage emerged. Doctors continued treating patients despite enormous personal risk. Religious communities cared for the dying. Ordinary neighbors shared food with families who had lost everything. Many knowingly placed themselves in danger to help complete strangers. History often remembers disasters through death statistics, but it should also remember extraordinary courage. One lesser-known fact illustrates how dramatically daily life changed. In some cities, legal courts temporarily suspended many normal activities because judges, clerks, and witnesses had either fled or died. Even governments struggled to function. Administration itself began breaking down. The plague affected every level of society. Kings lost trusted advisors. Noble families disappeared. Monasteries became nearly empty. Universities suspended teaching. Trade nearly collapsed across many regions. Fields remained unharvested because there were too few workers left alive. The consequences reached far beyond medicine. Europe's entire economy began changing. Labor suddenly became scarce. For generations, peasants had possessed little bargaining power. Now landowners desperately needed workers. Survivors discovered something unexpected. Their labor had become valuable. Wages slowly increased in many places. Some peasants negotiated better conditions. Others left their villages seeking greater opportunities elsewhere. The social order that had existed for centuries began shifting. Historians still debate this today. Did the Black Death directly weaken the feudal system? Or did it simply accelerate changes already underway? Most scholars believe both explanations contain elements of truth. The pandemic acted like a powerful force pushing existing transformations forward. The world after the plague would never fully resemble the world before it. Imagine standing inside a noble estate several years after the worst outbreak. Large fields stretch into the distance, but there are too few workers to cultivate them. Landowners compete to attract laborers. Opportunities once considered impossible suddenly become real. The balance of power slowly begins changing. Perhaps the greatest irony of the Black Death is this. A disaster that caused unimaginable suffering also transformed European society in unexpected ways. Economic structures evolved. Urban life gradually recovered. New ideas about public health emerged. Governments recognized the importance of monitoring disease more carefully. Several Italian city-states developed more organized quarantine systems to reduce future outbreaks. These measures would influence public health policies for centuries. But this was only the beginning. The plague itself never completely disappeared. For hundreds of years, outbreaks returned again and again. Each generation feared that the nightmare might begin anew. Cities developed emergency plans. Ports inspected arriving ships. Medical knowledge slowly improved, though the true cause of plague remained unknown until centuries later. Then came one of history's greatest scientific breakthroughs. In 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, the Swiss-French physician Alexandre Yersin identified the bacterium now known as Yersinia pestis. At last, humanity understood the microscopic enemy responsible for one of history's deadliest pandemics. A mystery that had haunted civilizations for more than 500 years had finally been solved. Before we continue to the final chapter, if you're enjoying this documentary, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating cinematic documentaries about history's greatest mysteries, forgotten civilizations, and world-changing events. Because the greatest surprise in this story isn't how the Black Death began. It's how the survivors rebuilt an entirely different world from the ruins of the old one. And that final chapter reveals why the legacy of the Black Death is still with us today. The worst years of the Black Death eventually came to an end. But Europe did not wake up to the same world. The villages still stood. The castles still overlooked the countryside. The great cathedrals still reached toward the sky. Yet almost everything else had changed. The pandemic had reshaped civilization itself. Imagine returning to your hometown after years away. The streets are familiar, but many faces are gone forever. Homes stand abandoned. Fields once filled with farmers have become overgrown. Entire family names have disappeared from local records. Churches contain new memorials for countless victims. The silence tells a story that no words can fully describe. What happened next shocked everyone. Instead of collapsing permanently, European society slowly began to rebuild. With fewer workers available, surviving laborers gained greater bargaining power. In many regions, wages increased. Landowners who had once dictated every condition now had to negotiate. The balance between peasants and nobles gradually shifted. Although change was uneven and often resisted, historians widely agree that the Black Death accelerated profound social and economic transformations. The truth was far more complicated. The pandemic also transformed the way governments thought about disease. Italian city-states such as Venice introduced increasingly organized quarantine systems. Ships arriving from infected regions were required to remain isolated before passengers could enter the city. Health officials monitored ports more carefully. Local governments began recording outbreaks with greater precision. These early public health measures were imperfect, but they laid important foundations for future disease control. Medicine itself slowly evolved. For centuries, physicians had relied on ancient theories about imbalances in the body. The Black Death exposed the limitations of those ideas. Although the true cause of plague would not be discovered until the 19th century, the pandemic encouraged closer observation, record-keeping, and eventually scientific investigation. One lesser-known fact illustrates how deeply the plague influenced culture. The constant presence of death inspired artists, writers, and musicians throughout Europe. Images of skeletons, hourglasses, and the dance of death became powerful reminders that wealth, status, and power offered no protection against mortality. These works reflected a society struggling to understand unimaginable loss. Historians still debate this today. Exactly how many people died during the Black Death? Modern estimates vary, but many scholars believe between 75 and 200 million people may have died across Europe, Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East during the broader pandemic. The uncertainty exists because medieval records were often incomplete or lost. Even so, nearly every historian agrees on one point. No other pandemic in recorded history has had such a devastating demographic impact over such a short period. The plague did not disappear after 1351. It returned again and again over the following centuries. Cities experienced repeated outbreaks. Communities remained fearful whenever unusual illnesses appeared. Generations grew up knowing that the disease might one day return. Only with advances in microbiology, sanitation, antibiotics, and public health did humanity finally gain effective tools to control plague. Then came another extraordinary discovery. In 1894, Alexandre Yersin identified the bacterium Yersinia pestis during an outbreak in Hong Kong. For the first time, scientists understood the microscopic cause of the disease that had haunted humanity for centuries. A mystery lasting more than 500 years had finally been solved. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of the Black Death is not scientific. It is human. The pandemic revealed both the worst and the best of humanity. Fear led to rumors, prejudice, and persecution. But courage inspired doctors, caregivers, religious communities, and ordinary people to risk everything for others. Some fled. Others stayed. Many sacrificed their own lives helping complete strangers. History remembers emperors and generals. But the true heroes of the Black Death were often ordinary men and women whose names have been forgotten. Parents who cared for sick children, neighbors who shared their last food, physicians who continued treating patients despite knowing the danger. Their quiet bravery became part of humanity's greatest story of resilience. The Black Death also reminds us that civilizations are more fragile than they appear. Powerful kingdoms, prosperous cities, thriving economies, all can be transformed by forces invisible to the human eye. At the same time, it demonstrates something equally remarkable. Human societies possess an extraordinary ability to adapt, to rebuild, to learn, to survive. The world that emerged after the Black Death was different from the one that existed before it. Labor systems evolved, trade recovered, universities expanded, scientific curiosity gradually increased. Public health slowly became a responsibility of governments rather than individuals alone. The pandemic became one of history's great turning points. Its influence can still be seen today. Modern disease surveillance, quarantine procedures, epidemiology, public health planning. Many of these concepts have roots that stretch back to lessons learned during medieval plague outbreaks. The greatest twist is this: the deadliest pandemic in history did far more than take lives. It reshaped economies, changed governments, influenced medicine, inspired art, transformed religion, accelerated social change, and forever altered humanity's understanding of disease. More than 6 centuries later, its echoes can still be heard. Every time scientists investigate a new outbreak, every time doctors work to contain an epidemic, every time nations cooperate to protect public health, the legacy of the Black Death lives on. It stands as one of history's greatest warnings and one of humanity's greatest stories of survival. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more forgotten civilizations, world-changing pandemics, legendary empires, and history's greatest mysteries, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had lived in Europe during the Black Death, what do you think would have been the greatest challenge? Fear of the disease itself, the collapse of society, or the uncertainty of not knowing what caused it? Let me know in the comments below. I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your perspective.